Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another week of PPA 500. As you know, we are near the end of our time together, so we have a Zoom session this evening. Then we have another Zoom session scheduled for next Tuesday. And then, if everything goes well, then next Tuesday will be our final Zoom session. And that's if everything goes well and we get through all of our information, which I highly anticipate that we will. As a reminder, in terms of our assignments due tonight by midnight, if you haven't already submitted, you have Canvas essay number 4, and then you have the midterm assessment. Then coming due next Tuesday, you have Canvas essay number 5, and Canvas essay number 5 draws upon the information we'll cover in the first part of class tonight, looking at the role of public administrators in the public policy process, specifically drawing upon the information we'll talk about with the different decision-making models and the 4 decision-making models that we'll talk about tonight. And what you'll do then for Canvas essay number 5 is select a public policy that you are interested in or a policy that you are familiar with. It could be any public policy as long as it's something that you're interested in. And then talk about which decision-making model most closely approximates how that policy was formulated. So you'll be picking one of the 4 models that we talk about in a few minutes. And then the last thing you'll do in the Canvas essay is to answer the question, are there any other decision-making models that would have been more appropriate to use in the formulation and development of the policy? So that's Canvas essay number 5, due by midnight next Tuesday. Now, I really hate to do this to you because I know that many people have already turned in the midterm assessment, but if you're still working on it to get it turned in tonight, I really hate to talk about the final assessment while you're still wrapping up the midterm assessment. But given that the final assessment is due in 2 weeks on March the 10th, we probably should go ahead and talk about the final assessment just so everyone's aware of what's on it and my expectations. The format of the final is exactly the same as the format for the midterm. So you have 5 scenarios, 2 questions related to each scenario. So a grand total of 10 questions, each question worth 10 points. So a total of 100 points on the final assessment. It is scenario based, and so just like with the midterm assessment, there are no right or wrong answers. Your answer will be evaluated based upon how well you justify your answer. So some of the information on the final assessment we are going to get to tonight. Some of the information we will not get to until class next week. So here are your scenarios. The first scenario is a scenario looking at the management of human resources, and that's one of the primary functions, as we know, that public administrators engage in. We'll get into a discussion of that for the most part next week. But in this scenario, you've applied for a position with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs as a policy analyst in January. In March, you received notice that you have been advanced to the next round of selection and you will be scheduled for an interview in early April. Finally, in late April, you are contacted again and an interview occurs on May the 15th. During the interview, you are told the process is ongoing and you'll be informed of the next steps within the next 6 weeks. You apply, you are interviewed, and you are hired. In early June, your friend referred you to a job with a private sector marketing firm. You apply, are interviewed, and hired on the spot. You accept the position with the private firm and lament the lost opportunity with the Department of Veterans Affairs. In early July, the Department of Veterans Affairs contacts you with a job offer that you must politely decline. So you've applied for this job in the VA, but you can't wait anymore to get hired. And so you accept a job in the private sector. And by the time the VA gets back to you, you've already accepted the job in the private sector and it's too late to take the job with the VA. So scenario question 1A, why did it take so long for the hiring process to occur in the federal government? What are some of the differences in working for the public versus private sectors? We already kind of know some of this from our discussion of Graham Allison and the differences between public and private organizations from a couple of weeks ago, but we'll fill in a lot of the gaps in this as we cover the management of human resources in class next week. Then in 1B, the evolution of hiring in the federal government has trended toward hiring people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities as opposed to which political party they support. Please discuss the three main eras of public employment and the evolution of hiring from the late 1700s until today. What era of employment are we currently in? Now, this is information we may or may not get to tonight, depending upon how we quickly progress through public policy and program evaluation. If we have time tonight, we'll talk about the three main eras in public employment. If not, then we'll hold off and do that at the beginning of class next week. And just like with the midterm exam, or I'm sorry, assessment, whenever you're responding to these questions, usually about a paragraph or two is certainly going to be enough to suffice. Then here in scenario number two, we get at the issue of collective bargaining in terms of the management of human resources. The maintenance department of the Department of Public Works maintains all public facilities within the city of Treetown. Treetown is a well-maintained community and prides itself on the cleanliness of its public facilities. However, as the city has grown over the past several years, the number of public facilities has grown as well. This has resulted in maintenance workers being asked to do more and often to complete work outside of their position descriptions. As a result, the maintenance workers bargaining unit, which is their union essentially, files a grievance that the additional new work has changed the work conditions of maintenance employees. The grievance eventually makes its way into the collective bargaining negotiations, and management and the bargaining unit have been struggling to come to an agreement over the issue. The bargaining unit declares an impasse when it's apparent that no agreement is on the horizon. 2A, what impasse resolution processes are available to the bargaining unit and the agency? Please discuss the three primary impasse resolution options. Again, if we have time, we'll get to that tonight. If not, we'll do that next week. Those are things like fact-finding, mediation, and arbitration. And then 2B, if you were a new director for this agency and had to direct your human resources manager to correct the issues of employees working outside of their descriptions, what functions of human resource management should your human resources manager do? That is information that we will definitely cover then in class next week. Then scenario 3 is the management of fiscal resources scenario. So the city of Preble Heights is struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in GDP rates, gross domestic product rates. Over the past 5 years, the city failed to complete its budget on time and struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and objectives. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and those are the two main credit rating agencies that will review debt that governments are issuing. Whenever governments go out there to borrow money, they will then assess the credit worthiness of that debt. They have both reduced the city's credit rating due to its budget issues. As a city council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns. 3A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in this scenario. So you'll be giving me one of the budget formats that we will talk about in the second half of class next week that you believe will be most appropriate and why. And then in 3B, we have another kind of a scenario within a scenario. Here we have an aquatic center that belongs to the city that needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it's clear that the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. The Aquatic Center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a $3 fee to use the facility, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. The city also charges a $20,000 per year fee to the school district and swim club teams to use the facility for practices. A total of 6 teams pay this fee. The operating expenses for the Aquatic Center amount to $180,000 per year. Since the city does not have the money to pay for renovations, it proposes a bond to cover the cost. What type of bond would you recommend and why? Again, in the second half of class next week, we will talk about how cities borrow money to pay for new capital projects and renovations to existing projects, such as a aquatic center. We'll talk about the different types of bonds they issue and their advantages and disadvantages. Here, you'll be selecting what you believe is the most appropriate bond for them to use to borrow this money for the renovations, and then justifying why that bond is the most appropriate. So again, all the information for scenario number 3 you will get in the second half of class next week. Then in scenario 4, we're continuing here with our fictional city of Preble Heights. The city of Preble Heights also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, otherwise known as ERD or ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate their facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. The primary beneficiaries of these grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city. Of course, this is primarily going to be downtown. To be successful, the policy would need to provide enough grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe that it is not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow walking grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. From a policy implementation perspective, utilize Pressman and Waldowski's implementation research to illustrate some of the barriers to successfully implementing this policy. Tonight, in a couple of minutes, we will talk about policy implementation as one of the phases in the policy process. And I'll introduce you to Pressman and Waldowski and their very famous study of Oakland, California in the 1970s and some of the obstacles that prevented successful implementation of public policies. Then in 4B, drawing upon the 4 models of organizational effectiveness, examine the scenario from the perspective of each of these models. How would each model define the agency's effectiveness in implementing this policy? This is information that we will again talk about tonight in class, and I'll present you with 4 different models of how we can assess effectiveness, and what you'll be doing is discussing those 4 models then in question 4B. Then our final scenario, number 5, it has now been 2 years since Preble Heights renovated its recreation center. The Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Julia Lopez, approached the council last year with a proposal to address juvenile delinquency in the city. The city has seen a rise in the incidence of graffiti and vandalism over the past several years. Ms. Lopez proposed creating a program of after-school sports offered free of charge at the recreation center. The after-school sports program is offered from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturdays. The goal of the program is to give youth something to do after school and deter them from engaging in acts of graffiti and vandalism. The program has been up and running for 1 year. You are a program specialist, and the city manager has approached you to create a program evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of the after-school sports program. So this is your program evaluation scenario, and this is, again, information we'll talk about tonight. So in question 5A, identify and discuss the primary independent, dependent, and control variables you would use in your program evaluation. And then in 5B, identify and discuss the research design you would recommend using to evaluate the effectiveness of this program. Jason, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Just because I missed the first couple of questions, so all of this information is what you'll go over tonight and next week.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So for the policy and program evaluation information in 4 and 5, that we will do tonight. The managing human resources, we have that scheduled for next week. We'll kind of see how we progress. If we have time tonight, then at the end of class tonight, we may talk about the eras of public employment. If not, then we'll hold that off to next week. But by the time we're done with class next week, you'll have all the information you need to do all 5 scenarios.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. So that is the final assessment. Like I said, all the same ground rules apply as applied to the midterm assessment. Be parsimonious, concise in your answers. 1 to 2 paragraph per question will be enough to get the job done. So again, everyone's doing really well on the midterm assessments. So far, the ones I have graded, all of the grades are in the A and the B range. And so, just keep doing on the final assessment what you did on the midterm. The approach that's working on the midterm will work then on the final assessment as well. As you start working on some of these scenarios over the next 2 weeks, as always, send me an email if you have any questions or need any clarifications, and I'm more than happy to provide those clarifications. And again, I apologize. I hate to hit you with the final assessment now while you're still working on the midterm for many people. So I don't like doing that, but I kind of have to just because of our limited schedule. We only have tonight and next week. So kind of had to do it tonight. Okay. Let's move on to information on, again, continue with this theme of the functions of public administration. We've talked about one of the main functions of public administration, and that is the function of leading and managing public and nonprofit organizations. We introduced to you before the idea of the theoretical perspectives on public administration and these theories on how we lead and manage our organizations. We talked about how those theoretical perspectives have evolved and changed over the past 150 years. Now, tonight, we're going to turn our attention to the function of the role of public administrators in public policy. And when we've talked about public policy before, we've talked about formulation and execution when we were comparing public versus private organizations. We talked about formulation and execution when we talked about the limitations that are inherent in the politics administration dichotomy from Woodrow Wilson. But tonight, I really want to dig a little bit deeper into what the policy process looks like and then the roles of public administrators in that policy process. So this is your foreshadowing of your PPA 670 policy analysis course. So as you go ahead and take PPA 670 in your future in the program, you will talk about different phases in the policymaking process. The first phase that you will probably talk about is this phase of formulation. Now, again, I use the term formulation and formation interchangeably. This is essentially when we are designing our public policies. Now, depending upon who you have for your 670 course, some folks, when they teach the policy course, they like to teach formulation separately from agenda setting. I kind of combined agenda setting into our discussion of policy formulation because, as we know from our discussion of John Gaventa in Mobilization of Bias, before a policy can be made, an issue must find its way onto the formal decision-making agenda of a policy-making body. So we talked about John Gaventa. There's a lot of agenda setting, mobilization of bias that was going on with the coal mine owners, being able to use campaign contributions and political influence to keep issues of mine safety off of the formal decision-making agenda of those state legislatures in Kentucky and Tennessee. And if an issue never makes it onto the formal decision-making agenda, then decisions will never be made and policies will never be formulated. One of the most famous public policy scholars who contributes to our understanding of agenda setting, how these issues get onto a formal decision-making agenda, is obviously John Kingdon. And John Kingdon provides us with his model, and you see the model on the screen there at the bottom of the screen, his policy stream convergence model. Kingdon makes the argument that in order for an issue to get on the formal decision-making agenda and then have a policy made about that issue, you have to have the convergence of three different streams: a problem stream, a proposal stream, and a political stream. The problem stream will be this stream of all these problems that are out there, that everyone in society kind of has an idea that these problems are existing, but there's never really been a policy that's been devised to try and address those problems. And when anyone out there says, well, there ought to be a law, when they say there ought to be a law, they're basically saying there ought to be a public policy. So we know there are a lot of problems that there ought to be laws about, but nothing has really ever been done about them. That's your problem stream. Then your second stream is what he calls your proposal stream. This is essentially proposals or solutions that could resolve that problem. So these are solutions that then need to come into contact with the problem in order to create the policy. But before these problems and these solutions can be brought together, we need to have the correct political environment. So the politics of the situation need to be right in order to bring problems and proposals together. When problems and proposals and politics all converge together, that then opens what Kingdom refers to as a policy window. And when that policy window opens, that then is what allows the issue to make it on the decision-making agenda of Congress or a state legislature or whatever policy-making body we are talking about. So that is what he calls his policy stream convergence. That is how agendas are established, according to John Kingdon, in these policy-making bodies. We will talk about a decision-making model called the garbage can model of decision-making in a couple of minutes that really closely approximates John Kingdon's agenda-setting policy stream convergence model. So obviously, you've got kind of what Kingdon would refer to as a primordial soup of problems. So in this primordial soup, you've got all these problems floating around out there. But through this policy stream convergence, we then open up a policy window to allow those problems to pull themselves out of this primordial soup and actually make it on the formal decision-making agenda. When an issue gets on the formal decision-making agenda, we then have to make decisions about how we are going to deal with that issue. Now, we want to really kind of base all this on what role public administrators play. And we know that public administrators have a role to play in agenda setting. If administrators in an agency see that a problem exists and it's not being addressed, then they can bring that to the attention of elected officials. They can bring that attention to client and constituency groups. And so we do have a role to play in this process of agenda setting. But we also have a very pronounced role to play on once this issue gets on the agenda, formulating and designing policies to address this problem or this issue. So policy making is all about making decisions. Which solution are we going to apply to which problem, and how are we going to apply that solution? So to understand policy making and the role of public administrators, we have to understand how decisions are made in the creation of public policies. So I'd like to introduce you to now, and you've probably seen some of these decision-making models before, but introduce you to four main decision-making models that can and are used in the policy formulation process. And those are rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model of decision-making. So rational comprehensive, you are probably familiar with. And we've talked about rationality before. We talked about it when we talked about Max Weber's theories last time. We know that rationality means that you are going to base your decisions on empirical information. Information that you can collect, information that you can analyze, and then use that analysis to make your decisions. That is rational decision making. Rational decision making attempts to be as comprehensive as possible. And so in rational comprehensive decision making, we will go through several different steps of a process. The first step in rational comprehensive decision making is we will clearly define and identify the goals that we are trying to achieve by formulating this policy. And hopefully, we'll not just be able to define the goals, but we will be able to get agreement among stakeholders on those goals. One of the issues that we'll talk about tonight, but not as much as you'll talk about in 670, is the issue of stakeholders. And in 670, a major part of that class will be focused on the identification of different stakeholders in the policy process, their vested interests, their resources and ability to affect the policymaking process. You'll talk a lot about stakeholders in 670. But we have to recognize tonight that with stakeholders, they don't always agree. And typically, they don't agree. And so one stakeholder may define a problem one way, another stakeholder or group defines a problem a different way. But in rational comprehensive, you have some clarity in terms of the definition of the goals and the problem and people agreeing upon those definitions. So once you have these clearly defined definitions of what you are trying to achieve by addressing this issue with the policy, the second step is to then go out there and collect all of the available information. So you go out there and collect all the information that is available. You collect that information. You then utilize that information for the purpose of identifying means or solutions for achieving your goals. What you will do is take all this information. When you identify all the means or the alternative solutions for achieving your goal, you will use that to generate a full range of alternatives. So you put together a full range of all the possible ways that we can address and solve this problem. So all the possible solutions that are out there. From that full range of alternative solutions, we will then select the quote unquote best solution, and that best solution will then become our public policy, and we can then go out there and implement that one best solution, that public policy. So the advantages here of rational comprehensive is number one, we're being rational. So we're using empiricism. So Max Weber would be very proud of us. Number two, we're being comprehensive, and that we're going out there and collecting all the available information, looking at all the possible alternatives, and then selecting the best possible alternative. The criticisms you're probably already aware of. It's not terribly realistic. In the real world of public administration, we don't have the time to be completely rational and comprehensive in our decision-making process. We have what Herbert Simon referred to as bounded rationality. And in this bounded rationality, we as human beings, we have parameters and limitations placed upon just how rational we can be. As human beings, we have these inherent cognitive limitations. There is only so much information that we can access, only so much information we can acquire, only so much information we can understand. So within that bounded rationality, within these cognitive limitations, chances are we are not going to be able to be rational, comprehensive every single time in our decision making. Also, another problem with being rational comprehensive is the problem of externalities. Externalities are these unintended consequences that if we take one action, here are the other things that will happen that perhaps we are not trying to cause, but they're going to happen anyway. In the world of policy, we refer to certain policies as being wicked problems. So we're trying to solve a wicked problem, which means in solving this problem we're focusing on, we're going to end up causing another problem in another area. And a lot of our problems we try and solve in policy are these types of wicked problems that have all these other unintended consequences. And we oftentimes cannot foresee what all those unintended consequences are because they have not yet occurred. They may not occur for another 6 months or a year, so we won't know what they are and be able to take them into account in our decision making until they've actually happened. So rational comprehensive sounds nice in a classroom setting, oftentimes does not work very well in the real world. And yeah, Nathan, that's a great quote of Donald Rumsfeld. There are certainly unknown unknowns, and he was very famous for saying that. And what you don't know is what you do not know. So, a second decision-making model is incrementalism. Incrementalism is the Charles Lindblom approach. And so Charles Lindblom wrote a very famous article several years ago, and his article was called The Science of Muddling Through. And in The Science of Muddling Through, Charles Lindblom essentially describes for us how decisions are typically made in the public sector. And in describing how decisions are made, he doesn't describe a rational, comprehensive system. Instead, he describes what he referred to as incrementalism. Incrementalism are these small changes from one year to the next. We see a lot of incrementalism in our budgeting process. We take last year's budget and we use this as a basis for this year's budget. We'll take the amount of money that we spent last year, we'll add on maybe 2 or 3%, and that becomes the budget for this next fiscal year. So he argues incrementalism is the far more practical approach that happens in public administration. In comparing rational comprehensive to incrementalism, he likens that comparison to the root versus the branch approach. The root approach is rational comprehensive, the branch approach is incrementalism. In rational comprehensive, we get to the root of the problem. In incrementalism, we deal with trimming the branches. We never actually get to the root of the tree. So, in this incrementalism approach, he argues that the steps are a little bit different. So in step one, we cannot clearly define and identify our goals. It's difficult to get agreement among all of our stakeholders on what the goals really are of trying to address this problem. Not only can we not get agreement among our stakeholders, but sometimes our goals and our solutions, our alternatives, those are actually intertwined together. So it's very difficult for us to parcel out what's our goal versus what is our means for achieving a goal. So it's a much muddier type of decision making. Secondly, since we have these cognitive limitations, this bounded rationality, we cannot go out there and collect all the possible information. Instead, we'll go out there and collect all the information that we can within our limited bounded rationality. Since we are not collecting all the possible information, because we don't know what all the possible information is and how to access it, it means that we are not going to be able to put together a full range of alternatives. Instead, we're going to put together a very limited range of alternative solutions. Since we have a limited range of alternative solutions, we will then engage in what Lindblom refers to as limited successive comparisons. So we'll compare solution A to solution B, and solution B to solution C, and solution C to solution D, and then solution A to solution D, and so on and so on. Through those limited successive comparisons, we will then be able to select the first appropriate solution that works for us in addressing this problem. Is it the best solution? We have no idea because we have not been able to go out there and collect all the information in order to put together a full range of solutions. That best solution may be something that we have never even considered. We've never even thought of it. So chances are it may not be the best, but it's going to be the first appropriate that works for us. Then we implement the first appropriate solution as our policy. So clearly with incrementalism, the advantage is it's much more practical. It's something that makes more sense on a daily basis when organizations are facing a lot of pressures from their external environment, especially a very politically charged environment. The criticism with incrementalism is that you're just kind of doing what you did before. And so if what you were doing last year, your policy that you were funding last year was not achieving its goals, then it's probably going to continue to not achieve its goals in the future. So you're going to continue making these mistakes year after year after year. Now, the literature initially would present to us these diametrically opposed options. You're either rational comprehensive or you are incremental. The fact of the matter is that it's really gradations in between. And so I don't think we should look at it as a binary, but rather look at it as more of a spectrum. That for some issues, we are more rational than we are for other issues. And Nathan, you're right. Since we use these appropriations and we use fiscal years, if you are appropriated money and you don't spend that money in a given fiscal year, there's a chance that you will get a budget cut the next fiscal year. And that's kind of the artifact of having these limited appropriations in fiscal years. Um, some governments have tried to get away from that and doing biennial budgeting, where they'll produce, some states will produce 2-year budgets. But yeah, a lot of organizations feel if they don't spend their appropriation in one given year, they're going to lose it in the next. And so they go out there and spend money. This is how the Department of Defense historically would end up getting their $600 toilet seats and all that type of ridiculous spending is because they felt if they didn't spend the money, they would end up losing it. But really try and look at rational, comprehensive, and incrementalism very much on a spectrum as opposed to just being a binary. And I think a really good example of that is in terms of the world of public budgeting. When we are making decisions about operating budgets, those budgets that pay for the day-to-day functioning of the organization, we tend to be much more incremental in nature. So deciding how much you're going to spend next year on supplies like staples for an office. You can look at what you spent last year and get a pretty good sense of what you're probably going to need for the next fiscal year. However, when we are making decisions about capital projects like renovating an aquatic center or constructing a new city hall or purchasing a new fleet of police vehicles, those are very high price tag, non-recurring, long lifespan projects. So we want to be as rational as we can possibly be in making those decisions. So we oftentimes separate that type of spending into a separate capital budgeting process. And we'll create capital improvement plans, which will be 5-year plans where we'll prioritize that spending. And we'll really put a lot of thought and a lot of effort into those types of capital projects. So I think the existence of operating budgets versus capital budgets that we see commonly at the state and local level, I think that's a really good illustration of rational comprehensive versus incrementalism and actually the difference in practice. When Charles Lindblom wrote this article, his article was met with a great deal of acclaim, and he won all kinds of awards for his theory of incrementalism. He was literally shocked by all the acclaim he got because he said when he wrote this article, all he was simply doing is he was simply just describing what was going on in public agencies and what was going on in the public sector. He didn't see it as developing new theory. He saw it as just describing the real world of the public sector. Well, if we have rational comprehensive and we have incrementalism, there's also that gray area in between. And the gray area in between is represented by a third decision-making model, which is mixed scanning. And that comes to us from Amitai Etzioni, one of my favorite names, Amitai Etzioni. Etzioni argues in mixed scanning that the approach we use, rationality or incrementalism, should depend upon the nature of the problem that we are trying to solve. Is it a big momentous issue, such as spending $100 million to construct a new capital project? Or is it a smaller, much more mundane issue, such as deciding, how many staples to buy for next fiscal year? For those big momentous issues, we're going to try and be as rational, comprehensive as we can be. For those smaller, more mundane issues, we can then get away with a more limited model such as incrementalism. So big issues, rationality, or at least approximate rationality, smaller issues, more incremental. Makes a lot of sense. You want to spend more time doing decision making on big decisions as opposed to smaller decisions. What's the problem with mixed scanning? What's the criticism? Rationale for big issues, incrementalism for small issues. Any problems with that approach? Yeah, Jason, go ahead.
I would say that approach is mostly beneficial. I mean, the only problem that I can think of with the mixed scanning approach would be the that situations have more nuance. Like just because something is a bigger issue doesn't necessarily mean that it warrants like the rationale, and then something being a smaller issue doesn't mean it necessitates like incrementalism.
Perfect. Absolutely. Raina, go ahead.
I was gonna say that approach seems a little too simplistic, right? I think there's a lot more things that could be put into play rather than just like one's a big issue, one's a small issue. And then the other thing, it doesn't talk about how you're gonna find like a big issue from a small issue. Or like maybe it's not it's not a big issue, but it's not a small issue either. It's like in that middle part, and where do you put those issues and stuff like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and Jason and Raina, you're exactly right. There's a lot of nuance here, and what is a big issue for one person may be a small issue for someone else. And how do you classify something as a big or a small issue? It's hard to get agreement sometimes on that. So there's a lot of subjectivity that is built into defining something as something that needs rationality versus something that could suffice with incrementalism. And that's the primary criticism associated with mixed scanning. Again, I think that we do see mixed scanning in the budgeting world, as I had illustrated, incrementalism for how many staples you're buying versus rationality for spending $100 million on a capital project. But oftentimes it's not that clear cut, and there is some subjectivity that is involved. Then our fourth decision-making model, I'm sorry, Raina, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just had a quick question. I think I missed it. What were the advantages of mixed scanning? Did you mention them by any chance?
Yeah, the advantage is that it kind of makes sense that we can kind of combine rationality and incrementalism together. So it kind of illustrates to us again, it's not kind of this binary situation between those two types of decision-making models, that sometimes we be rational, sometimes we be incremental. So they may not necessarily be mutually exclusive. And that's kind of the advantage of mixed scanning. But the fourth decision-making model, of which I am a fan, is garbage can model of decision making. And this model comes to us from authors Cohen, March, and Olson. And I think it's a great decision-making model. My problem with it is its name. And I really wish they would have named it something a little bit different than a garbage can model, because you think about garbage can, we make a decision, you reach in the garbage can, what you get is what you get. There's a lot more rhyme and reason to it than just that. But garbage can model decision making is really very much built on John Kingdon's agenda setting model. And these authors make the argument that we tend to make policy decisions at the confluence of four different streams. And those four different streams are the participant, the problem, the solution, and then what they call the choice opportunity stream. So when those four streams flow together at the confluence of those four streams, that's when we tend to make policy decisions. So let's look at each of those four streams, and I'll give you a couple of examples that I think really illustrate garbage can model decision making pretty well in terms of policy formulation. So your first stream, they refer to as the participant stream. In the participant stream, we have to have the quote unquote right people in decision making positions, which means you have to have people in policy making positions who are predisposed to making a change to the way in which we are addressing this problem with a policy. So you have to have people who are in place who can make these decisions and are really inclined to make these changes. If you have policymakers who are not inclined to make a change, then you're clearly not going to get a major change to your policy. So you have to have the right people in place. And so here we're looking at people in the legislature have to be predisposed to accepting that we need to make a change to our current approach. A chief executive who is also predisposed that we need to make this type of a change. A good example of having the participant stream in place was welfare reform in the mid 1990s. So in the mid 1990s, we had a Republican-controlled Congress, and that Republican-controlled Congress, led primarily by the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, they had their contract with America, and their contract with America was really predicated on reducing spending. And one of the ways they were going to reduce spending was by moving people from welfare to work. You had in the White House Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton was a more moderate Democrat. He had been the head of the Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC, which was primarily the group of Democratic governors who were centrists. And so he also kind of agreed that we needed to try and find a way to move people from welfare to work. So he had the participants in place, even though they were from different parties, who agreed on the general problem. And the general problem was that welfare was kind of this self-perpetuating type of policy where future generations would be on welfare because previous generations were on welfare. So we needed to find a mechanism, a solution to move people from welfare to work. So you had these participants in place who were predisposed to making a change. Then, secondly, you had your problem stream. The problem stream means that there is a problem that people have agreed about the definition to that problem. So again, you had a Democratic president and you had a Republican majority in Congress that agreed that the problem was finding a way to move people into gainful employment. So they had agreed upon what the problem was. Then we had a solution stream. We had to have solutions to address those problems. Now, this is where the garbage can model decision making kind of gets to be what I like to refer to as a Quentin Tarantino model of decision making. And if you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that his movies tend to be non-sequential. They kind of go out of chronological order. Well, here, garbage can model decision making can also be non-sequential. It's a non-linear type of decision making in that solutions may predate problems. In welfare reform, the example of a solution predating the problem was the use of what is called a block grant. A block grant is a general grant of money from the federal government down to state or local governments with fewer strings attached than what were traditionally used by the national government, freeing up state and local governments to use money basically how they saw fit, as long as they were furthering the goal of the policy, which was to move people from welfare to work. I see Jason asked, remember hearing Bill Clinton was one of the few modern presidents who left with a surplus as opposed to a deficit. That is correct. How did he do this? That's a great question. It was really a multifaceted approach. The way in which it was done was number one, we had some changes to the budgeting process. We had a 1990 Budget Enforcement Act that imposed some fiscal discipline on how Congress could spend money. We then had in 1993 and 1997 what were called balanced budget acts. Those balanced budget acts continued that theme of reducing spending, but also called for some increases, some modest increases to revenue through tax increases. So we had a reduction in spending combined with the increase in revenue, but the real big missing component there was the dot-com boom. And so we had this huge boom in the internet and Silicon Valley. That dot-com boom, when the internet exploded, you had a ton of money going into federal income tax coffers, and you had this great explosion in the amount of revenue. As Nathan correctly says, combine that then with a large drop in defense spending. Remember, during the Clinton Gore administration, part of their reinvention of government was to downsize the federal government. They downsized the federal workforce by about 325,000 positions. When they downsized by 325,000 positions, a large majority of those positions that were eliminated were positions in the Department of Defense, because it's what we call the peacetime dividend, as we refer to it. Yeah, a lot of bases were closed. It became a very political issue where you had a lot of hearings in Congress on base closures, and you had members of Congress trying to keep the bases in their districts open, fighting against other members of Congress. And so that decrease in spending, especially in the Department of Defense, combined with this explosion of revenue, that then allowed us to get out of deficit spending and get into surplus spending. There's a very famous video, you can probably find it online, of President Clinton and Vice President Gore doing a press conference where they had a whiteboard, and on the whiteboard they wrote zero, and that we are finally at a zero deficit. Now, some people will contend that even though we were at a zero deficit, some of that zero deficit was a zero deficit on paper, and not to get too much into the weeds, but we still had deficits that we were running. Well, what would eventually become deficits we were running in some of our entitlement funds, such as a Social Security Trust Fund. But overall, in terms of at least discretionary spending, we had finally gotten into a situation of surplus spending. I believe it was in 1999 and 2000. Then we had the terrorist attacks of September 11th in 2001. the resulting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we went back into deficit spending again, and we have remained in deficit spending today. So that's a long-winded answer for kind of how the Clinton and Gore administration was able to undo these deficits that we've been struggling with since 1969. So from 1969 to the end of the Clinton administration, we were running federal budget deficits each and every year. When you're running a federal budget deficit and you want to create a new policy and fund that new policy, you have to do it in one of two ways. One way is by finding additional sources of revenue. The second way is by cutting spending in other areas. The Budget Enforcement Act made it more difficult for you to cut spending in one policy area to pay for an increase in spending in another policy area. Whenever we typically would go out there and try and raise more revenue, you either do that through raising taxes or you do it through borrowing money. So we all know what Congress prefers to do. Congress prefers to borrow money. As they borrow money, you not only see running a deficit on an annual basis, but you then also contribute to your overall national debt. So we really have to have people in place in these positions who want to make a decision. We have to have a good, clear identification and agreement on what the problem is. We then have to have some of these solutions that we can then pluck from these solutions and apply the solution to the problem. Again, in welfare reform, that solution was the use of a block grant. We got the creation of temporary assistance and needy family grants, a block grant that would replace the old assistance to families with dependent children, which is a more categorical grant. With this TANF grant, this block grant, it then allowed state governments to have more flexibility in how they were spending their money, as long as how they spent the money would contribute to achievement of the policy goal of trying to get people from welfare to work. So if you want to spend that TANF money on childcare programs, on job training programs, on computer literacy programs, you have flexibility in how you spend it, as long as how you're spending it contributes to the ultimate policy goal. We saw some states that were incredibly successful at moving people from welfare to work. One example was the state of North Dakota. North Dakota, in a very short period of time, reduced welfare rolls by about 75%. However, it wasn't necessarily because of the law. It was because of the oil industry. And so the oil industry at that time was exploding in North Dakota. North Dakota didn't have enough people, enough citizens to actually hire people to work in the oil industry. And so basically, if you lived in North Dakota and you were willing to work in the oil industry, there was a job sitting there waiting for you. And so a state like North Dakota was highly successful because of their macroeconomic type of situation they were currently in at the time. Other states that didn't have an oil boom, they were not quite as successful. But again, the important thing here is this non-sequential. You can select solutions that have been developed maybe decades before and apply them to your present day problem. Block grants were developed decades ago. We saw block grants used in the 1940s and the 1950s, so it was not a new innovation. We could take it, apply it to this current day problem. And then your fourth stream is what they refer to as the choice opportunity stream, or a triggering event. Choice opportunity stream is a triggering event that occurs that galvanizes opinion, not only among policymakers, but also opinions among the public, that we really need to make a change to the way in which we are dealing with this policy. And that triggering event, an example from, the creation of TSA and the Department of Homeland Security, obviously the triggering event was September 11th. So something happens, galvanizes public opinion, draws all these streams together, and at that confluence of those streams, that's where we typically see policies being made, or at least major changes made to our existing policy approaches. Here's another quick example of a garbage can model of decision making in policy formulation. In this one, we have the value jet crash. The value jet crash that occurred in 1996 was an airline disaster where value jet flight number 582 crashed in the Florida Everglades, killing 110 people. That was a triggering event. In terms of the participant stream, when that triggering event occurred, we had consumer rights groups, airline safety groups, and members of Congress who were all and a president who were all very much inclined toward making a change to try and prevent this event from occurring again. The problem in terms of airline safety was the inability to identify a fire on a plane until it was too late. And that's what happened in ValueJet 582. A fire had broken out in the cargo area of the plane. There were no smoke detectors in the cargo area of the plane. So by the time that the fire was noticed by the crew, it had already burned through a lot of the logistical support of the plane, the electrical panel on the plane. And by the time that happened, the plane was unrecoverable and unfortunately then crashed in the Florida Everglades. So we know the problem is we need to try and alert crews more quickly to a fire in the plane. The solution is an age-old solution that we have had for decades, and that's smoke detectors. So we bring it all together. We then have a policy that requires the placement of smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes in order to try and avoid this incident from happening again. That's kind of a nice example, pretty clean example of garbage can model decision making in terms of how we formulate these policies. The one thing we do have to remember in the policy formulation process is that it tends to be a highly political process. As we had talked about before, in policy formulation, we have not just elected officials, but also public administrators involved in formulation. Even though they are both involved, their motivations oftentimes are different. So the motivations, hopefully, of public administrators is to make good policy. So by making this policy, we could hopefully avoid future airline disasters that were caused by this problem. Elected officials, hopefully they want to avoid airline disasters in the future as well, but they're also looking at how can we mollify these consumer rights groups, these airline safety groups, what impact does this have on our reelection prospects? So even though you have both involved, their motivations can be somewhat different in policy formulation. Now, again, when you get to 670, you'll talk a lot more about this first phase of policy, which is policy formulation. You'll talk a lot about agenda setting. You'll talk a lot about the stakeholders who are involved in formulating and designing these policies. But once a policy has been formulated, it then obviously has to be implemented and executed. And I use implementation, execution, again, kind of interchangeably. So our second main phase in the policy process is policy implementation. And this is obviously where public administrators have a very big role to play. In your basic civics definition of American government, it's the job of the administrators to implement these policies and carry out the goals in the policy as established by the policymakers themselves. Implementation can certainly be a very difficult part of the process. Even the best designed policies can certainly struggle when they get to the policy implementation phase. And as I told you, you have one question on your final assessment that looks at the work of these two authors, Pressman and Wildavsky. So Jeffrey Pressman and Aaron Wildavsky. Pressman and Wildavsky were very interested in why policies fail at implementation. And so they did a case study. And their case study looked at what was called the EDA, the Economic Development Agency, and why the Economic Development Agency, why its implementation in Oakland, California was not successful. And so in their study of Oakland, California, they found that there were numerous different obstacles that prevented the proper implementation of the EDA. Some of the issues that they recognized in implementation were issues such as what I've listed on the screen. Number one, multiple goals. That if there are multiple conflicting policy goals, it makes it difficult to implement the policy because obviously if you have multiple conflicting policy goals, then your implementers, your administrators don't really know which goal to try and pursue. So the more goals you have, the more tendency for conflict between goals, and the less likely it is that you will successfully implement that policy. Secondly, they said the more decision points there are, the more decisions that implementers need to make, the more difficult it becomes to properly implement these policies. So if you have implementers who have to make very important decisions about how these policies need to be implemented, as opposed to those decisions being built into the design of the policy, you're going to have less successful implementation. The third one is intensity and direction of the participant. So these implementers, how strongly do these implementers support or how strongly do they oppose this policy? Clearly, the ones who strongly favor the policy are going to work harder at implementing it. You'll have much more successful implementation. Those who are more opposed to it will work against it. They'll try and slow walk it. And so the intensity and direction of the participants, the implementers themselves, will have a big impact. Fourth, the amount of bargaining that is involved. The more there is bargaining between the implementers, the less the chance for successful implementation. And then finally, new agencies. One of the federal government's favorite strategies, if they want to get a state or local government to implement a federal policy and achieve federal policy objectives, is to create a new agency, an agency that is dedicated to implementing this policy. But when you create a new federal agency, you are then stepping on the toes of the state or local government. And then you end up having these turf wars between the new federal agency and the agencies at the state and the local level. And Nathan makes a point, interesting to bring up Oakland. Oakland's currently looking to seriously overhaul its city charter due to structural issues with accountability and decision making. I think that is something that's not just endemic to Oakland. I think a lot of cities are having those same types of problems. And so Oakland is trying to be a little bit more proactive, perhaps in other cities, and actually overhauling its charter to try and overcome some of those issues. And accountability in implementation is a difficult thing to achieve, especially when you have a lot of people making all kinds of different decisions. You have people who have a different buy-in for the policy than other people. You have a lot of bargaining. It makes it difficult to implement these policies. So I think the moral of the story here is even very well designed and formulated policies can fail at the implementation stage and probably will unless we can address those obstacles that Pressman Wildavsky highlight. Of those five obstacles, the one that Pressman Wildavsky really drilled down on is this idea of the intensity of the implementers. And so what you see on the screen there is a very simple 2x2 matrix that shows you along the top the intensity of the implementer, along the side the direction of the implementer. So how positive or negative does this implementer view this policy? And then in the columns, how strongly, how weakly they either support or oppose it. So your ideal situation from implementation is obviously going to be that top left-hand cell. You have implementers who strongly support implementation of the policy. That's where you'll have very minimal delay in implementation. That's where you'll hopefully have an absence of bargaining. And so the policy will get implemented as it's supposed to be implemented in a very quick and efficient fashion. So that's your best case scenario. Clearly, your worst case scenario is the cell below that, where you have implementers who strongly oppose the policy. That's where you get maximal delay. That's where you get a lot of bargaining over the very essentials of the policy itself. Those are policies that are unlikely to ever be properly implemented. Then kind of your middle ground, your right two cells, the top right, these are implementers who support the policy, but not strongly supportive. You have minor delays. You're probably not going to have a whole lot of bargaining, but they'll just, won't work as hard to implement the policy, but they won't try and object to that policy and stop it. And then the bottom right, those who have a negative view of the policy, but not terribly strongly negative view of the policy. There you have moderate delays. And there you have bargaining over what the authors call the peripherals of the policy. So not really the essentials, but kind of around the edges. And so the less important aspects of the policy, that's where you're going to get a lot of that bargaining. So the question then becomes, using Pressman and Wildowski's polemic, how do we get our implementers into that top left-hand cell where they are strongly supportive of the policy? Martha Durthick, who is another famous public administration theorist, makes the argument that the most appropriate way to get people to strongly support the implementation of a policy is by involving them in formulation. So those individuals who are going to be charged with the day-to-day implementation of a policy, we need to involve those people in the actual design and formulation of that policy. The more they're involved in formulation, the more likely it is that they will then support the implementation of the policy. Again, it sounds like a basic maxim that we all know and something that's been around for years in public administration, but I think it's very much true that if you involve your implementers, they'll be more likely to strongly work toward implementing that policy. When you take your 670 class, you will talk about Preston Wildowski again. You will talk about policy implementation, and you'll put a little bit more flesh on the bones in terms of some of these obstacles to policy implementation, and then how we can address and try and rectify those types of obstacles. Then the last stage of policy is policy evaluation. So we obviously are very interested. If we're putting all this money into the implementation of this policy, we certainly hope that this policy will be successful at achieving its goals. So we're going to be looking at the outcomes of that policy. And when we talk about the outcomes of a policy, we're talking about the consequences of the policy, the actual achievement of whatever goals we are trying to achieve. The evaluation part of the process is predicated upon feedback. And so in the policy process, you always have to have a feedback loop. So as you evaluate the policy and you look at how well it's achieving its goals, you have to then feed that information back into the formulation and implementation parts of the process, because sometimes if we're not achieving our goals, it is a design issue that we have not designed the policy in the proper way. Sometimes it's an implementation issue that we are just not implementing it the way in which will make the policy successful. So we always have this feedback loop back into policy formulation and back into policy implementation. The big problem we run into with policy evaluation is trying to evaluate policies before they are ready to be evaluated. We'll talk in a second about the differences between public policies and public programs. But one of the big differences between policies and programs is that policy goals tend to be a little bit more abstract and a little bit more difficult to measure than the goals of public programs. Public programs tend to be much easier to measure, kind of lend themselves more to empirical measurement than sometimes the goals of public policies. So if a public policy has kind of abstract, difficult measure outcomes to begin with, if we try and measure those outcomes too early, the policy is going to look like a failure. Some of those outcomes may take 6 months or a year or 3 years or 5 years for them to actually materialize. So if you've got outcomes that are not going to materialize for 5 years and you try and evaluate this policy in year one, obviously the policy is going to look like it is a failure. So one of the devices you'll learn in policy analysis is what's called an evaluability assessment. And it kind of sounds redundant, but in an evaluability assessment, you evaluate whether or not the policy is ready to be evaluated. I know it sounds very redundant, but you evaluate the policy in terms of when you anticipate seeing these outcomes. When you have to, kind of forecast and do what we call scenario writing. And in policy, we do a lot of scenario writing where we'll say, if this policy is implemented, here's the scenario that we think will occur if this policy is properly implemented. So when we look at that scenario that we think will occur, is this scenario going to occur in a month, a year, 10 years? We have to look at when these outcomes are going to occur and then not actually evaluate the policy itself until the policy has had a chance to result in its intended outcomes. So we oftentimes do evaluability assessments to determine which policies are ready to be evaluated. Again, you'll talk more about that when you get to 670. If you've lived through audits, you know that audits can really contribute to the evaluation of both policies as well as programs. The two types of audits we tend to use in evaluation are your financial legal audits and your performance management based audits. Financial legal audits will look at how we spent the money on this policy and if we spent the money in the legally appropriated manner. Management or performance-based audits will ask the question, how well did we spend the money? And in these performance management-based audits, this is where we get at the heart of the question of how effective this policy or this program really is. But those are essentially the primary phases in the policy process. Again, just to kind of give you a little introduction into what you'll be talking about in much more detail when you get to your 670 policy analysis course. But up to this point in time, we've been talking about public policies. We really do need to distinguish between a public policy and what is a public program. Now, a major caveat here is that there are some MPA programs, NASPA accredited MPA programs, that do not make this differentiation. They will have one core course in their curriculum that is public policy and program evaluation, and they will combine them together into one course. We separate them into two separate courses in our program because the methodologies we use for policy analysis will be different than the methodologies we use for program evaluation. Because again, what we're evaluating with public policies is more general and more difficult to measure than sometimes what we're measuring with public programs. So to kind of visualize this difference between what is a policy and what is a program, I like to kind of use the example of a bridge. So the policy is the bridge. It is what you drive on. It is the overarching way to get from point A to point B. But that bridge would collapse if it didn't have its pillars underneath it holding it up. The policy is the bridge. The public programs are those pillars. So those pillars are those specific things that hold that bridge up. Public programs are those specific things that hold the policy up. So public programs contribute to the achievement of those overall policy goals. So you may have a policy goal, such as that focuses on educating at-risk youth. And so your goal is to enhance the educational attainment of at-risk youth. That's your overarching policy goal. That policy of educating at-risk youth can then be supported by these specific public programs. So perhaps you'll have a program such as after-school basketball. You may have a program such as a after-school tutoring program, a computer literacy program. Whatever those programs are, they are much more specific types of approaches to then hold up and achieve the overall policy goal of educating at-risk youth. So it's kind of this general versus specific focus to compare policies to programs. When you go into PPA 696 research methods, I use the air quotes because that's actually what the course is called, but as we all know, it's really a program evaluation course. You will be introduced to different ways in which you can evaluate these specific public programs from an empirical basis. And the major purpose of program evaluation is to apply these empirical methods to try and determine the effectiveness of these specific public programs. I think we all have a general sense of what empirical means. We've talked about it in class before. We talked about it with Max Weber last week. Empirical means that it's tangible information, information that we can collect, information we can analyze, and then use that information to then render conclusions and decisions. So we're relying upon that empirical information. So our goal in program evaluation is to come up with methodologies in which we can identify what type of empirical information we need to collect, ways in which to collect that information, from whom we're going to collect that information, how we are going to analyze that information, and then the standards we're going to use in order to take that information and use it to generate conclusions about the effectiveness of a program. So it's all based upon empirical information. So since we are coming up with ways to collect this empirical information, we are going to borrow very heavily from classic social science research methodologies. In previous years, like previous years, I'm talking well over a decade and a half ago, what we would do is we would focus on statistics. And so when we would teach Research Method 696, we would teach it not only as how do you design a program evaluation, but then how do you calculate and how do you interpret those statistics, just like you would in a research methods class. Today in 696, we have this prerequisite for having already completed an undergraduate statistics course or already having completed PPA 517 analytical skills development, which is essentially statistical analysis, so that you'll already have that statistical training before you come into 696. So we really can focus in 696 more on the application of methods as opposed to the calculation of statistics. And so that's kind of our new generation PPA 696 research methods course. Should the title be changed to program evaluation? Probably. Probably should have been done by now, but I think that kind of the department wants to avoid the very cumbersome curriculum process, and so that's why they've kind of kept it as research methods. But it also is because we are applying research methods to the evaluation of public programs. Now, in your 696 course, you will talk about different types of program evaluations. There are program impact evaluations and program implementation evaluations. Clearly, when we're looking at the effectiveness of a program in terms of its intended outcomes, we are doing a program impact evaluation. We can also do program implementation evaluations where we evaluate how well the program is being implemented in terms of how the money is being spent, the jobs that everyone's doing on the part of being implementers, and really look at the implementation process itself. Oftentimes, what we will do in a holistic approach is we'll combine them both together. So we'll look at both the impact as well as the implementation. So the question then becomes, how do we actually do program evaluation? What are the steps that we go through in evaluating public programs? And I think that is a wonderful topic to get into after we take an evening break. So let's go ahead and take a break until about 5:30. We'll come back at 5:30 and then we'll get into some of the granular details in terms of how we actually evaluate public programs to get you ready for your PPA 696 course. Once we are finished with that discussion, then we'll talk about this term of effectiveness, because our ultimate goal in running our organizations, in implementing policies and implementing programs, our ultimate goal is trying to achieve effectiveness. And so we'll talk about some different definitions of effectiveness and which definitions are appropriate in which types of situations. So go ahead and take a break until 5:30. We'll come back and get into the details on program evaluation. It's 5:30, so we are back. So let's talk, and we won't spend a whole lot of time on this because I think most people have had undergraduate research methods. And what I really want to do is just kind of focus on how we take those methods and how we then modify them to make them serve our purposes of evaluating public programs. And that's what we do in 696 is we take these classic social science research methods and we put them within the service of evaluating public programs from an empirical basis. So just like if you were doing a classic social science research project, your first step here is to identify your purpose. So identify your evaluation purpose, your evaluation question. So we have to, in writing a evaluation question, we usually adhere to the same requirements that we would normally adhere to in writing a research question. As we know, good, quote unquote, good research questions are clear in that everyone understands what the question is asking. They are answerable, because if they are not answerable, if it's something that cannot be answered based upon empirical evidence, that is going to be problematic. And not only being answerable, but they also should have more than one possible answer. If there's only one possible answer, then we probably already know what that answer is. So here are a couple of examples, and these examples come from the research methods case study that was used in PPA 697, probably at this point about 10 years ago. The first question, does the Inmate Reading Intervention Program, otherwise known as IRIP, decrease rates of recidivism? So in the case study, there's the creation of this new reading program that would be provided to inmates, hope being that this program would increase literacy levels, and by increasing literacy levels, hopefully that would then have a reduction in rates of recidivism. So here we're talking about a directional type of evaluation question. Does the program decrease rates of recidivism? Another way is to ask it in a non-directional manner. How does the inmate reading intervention program affect rates of recidivism? So those are just two kind of basic examples. Oftentimes in classic social science research, we prefer the how as opposed to the does questions because how questions tend to provide more robust, detailed results than what you would get with just a is or a does question. I think that rule is a little bit more flexible in evaluation designs because, we're doing these for the purpose of seeing is the program achieving its intended outcome. We have very few resources oftentimes to put into program evaluations. There's not a lot of political gain for budget makers who spend a lot of money on program evaluations. And so we oftentimes do these evaluations on a shoestring at best. And so sometimes we don't really have the resources to ask those more robust how types of questions. But we have to develop an evaluation question. That evaluation question is then going to be predicated upon the variables that we are asking about. So just like in classic social science research, we have to develop our dependent, primary independent, and control variables. So we understand the dependent variable in a program evaluation. This is the variable that's being changed. This is the outcome of the program. So rates of recidivism is the outcome, so therefore it is the primary dependent variable. So dependent variable is going to be the outcome. The primary independent variable, as we all know, is the variable that changes the dependent variable. So a change in the independent variable results in the change in the dependent variable. So here in program evaluation, our primary independent variable will be some measure of the program itself. Now, there are a multitude of different ways in which we can measure the program itself. One way we can measure the program itself is through program participation. So our operational indicators for that variable could be whether or not the person participated in the program. That would be our dichotomous binary variable. So we would score all the cases that participated as a 1, all those that did not participate as a 0. So that's one way to measure the variable. We could also measure participation in terms of frequency of participation. So we could measure it on a more interval level where we would measure it based upon the number of hours that someone participated in the program. So that's another way we can measure participation. We could also measure that independent variable based upon program existence. And this is something we would probably do if we're doing a longitudinal analysis where we are measuring our variables over a long period of time. So what we could do is we could say we're going to measure that dependent variable of rates of recidivism for several years before the inmate reading intervention program was implemented, and then for several years after it was implemented. We're looking at changes in the patterns in our data before the program was implemented versus changes in the in the data on the program after the program has been implemented. Jason, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, just as a refresher, in public administration, do they only look at like control variables as a means of changing the dependent variable or affecting it, or do they also look at like mediating variables and things like that?
That's a good question. It would be the answer is it's both. And so one of the reasons why we use control variables, and control variables will be other independent variables that could have an impact upon the dependent variable. One reason why we do those control variables is to try and isolate the true relationship between participation in the program and the intended outcome. So by introducing these other control variables, we can then parcel them out of the equation and truly isolate the real relationship between participating in the program and the dependent variable. So that's one primary reason why we use the control variables. Another reason we use control variables is just what you talked about, to try and identify intervening relationships. And so sometimes we'll postulate a spurious correlation where we'll say participation in the program is associated with the dependent variable, when really it's associated with an intervening variable, and then that intervening variable is associated with the dependent variable. So sometimes we'll use those control variables to try and identify those intervening relationships so that we can avoid committing those spurious types of correlations. And so we kind of use it for both reasons. Another reason why we use control variables, a related reason, is from a design perspective that, as we'll talk about in a second, it is difficult, if not impossible, for us to decide who participates in a public program. When that public program is implemented is beyond our control as an evaluator. And if it's an entitlement-based program where people get benefits because they are legally eligible for those benefits, we cannot deny them those legally entitled benefits just for the purpose of our evaluation. So we're not able to say, well, this group of people participate in the program and this group of people will not participate in the program. So when we're not able to randomly assign people to either participate or not participate, then we'll develop these control variables to try and create equivalency between those two groups, those who are participating and those who are not participating. So we use those control variables to then make sure that both groups are equivalent, so that if there is a difference in the outcome, the dependent variable, we can attribute that difference in the dependent variable to whether or not they participated in the program. So it's kind of an all of the above type of answer to control variables. And so it is very important for us in program evaluation to identify the correct variables to control so we can truly isolate the relationship between participation in the program and the intended outcome of that program. If we do not identify the correct control variables, then, as you may remember from your undergraduate research methods class, you are committing a type of error known as specification error. And specification error says that you are not specifying the correct variables, so therefore you're not able to, with any type of confidence, say that yes, participation in the program is resulting in this intended outcome. So just like in social science, it is important here for us to identify our variables and then develop our operational indicators, ways in which we are going to measure those variables. Now, once we have an idea of what we are measuring in terms of our variables, what the outcome is, how we're going to measure participation in the program, then we have to select a research, or as we call it, an evaluation design. Evaluation designs are somewhat different than research designs in that, if you remember from your undergraduate research class, the gold standard oftentimes in a research design is an experimental design. So in an experimental design, we are randomly assigning some people to be exposed to the independent variable and randomly assigning other people to not be exposed to that independent variable. But we, as the researcher, have the ability to do that type of random assignment. The first example there is that classic experimental design. And you may remember the notation. The R stands for random assignment. The O stands for observation, so this is a data collection point, and the X stands for the independent variable. So in your top line group, your ROXO group, those are people who are randomly assigned to get the independent variable. They are observed before they're exposed to the independent variable and then observed after they're exposed to the independent variable. In classic social science research, that is what's known as an experimental group. Here in program evaluation, we refer to experimental groups as project groups. So this is a project group. These are the people who participate in the program. Then the second line is your control group. In program evaluation, we refer to that as a comparison group. So we compare our project group results to the results from a group that did not participate in the program. So we're comparing project groups to comparison groups as opposed to experimental versus control groups. Now, that's kind of that gold standard that we have in the social sciences. We understand, as I just mentioned, that in program evaluation, we as evaluators don't have the control to randomly assign people to either participate or not participate. If they are legally entitled to the benefits of participation, we have to allow them to participate in that program. So typically, we oftentimes cannot use experimental designs for our program evaluations. So instead, we have to use a quasi-experimental design. So in a quasi-experimental design, we cannot randomly assign some people to participate and some people not to participate. So instead, what we will do is we will use our control variables. So here's our other reason why we're using control variables. So we establish our control variables in order to create equivalency between our program participants and our non-participants, so that the only difference between our participants and our non-participants is that one group participated in the program, one group did not participate in the program. And that then allows us to isolate the true impact of program participation on the intended outcome, the dependent variable of the program. Very common type of quasi-experimental design that's used is this longitudinal time series analysis. The type that I described to you before, where we will measure our variables before the program was implemented and then measure them after the program was implemented, is a specific type of longitudinal time series analysis known as an interrupted time series analysis, or an ITS. Very common type of analysis, so we'll establish the pattern in our outcome before and then after the implementation of the program. Again, we don't control when the program is being implemented, so we're going to base this on data that exists because we don't have the ability to say the program starts here and ends there. So to interrupt the time series analysis, we won't get into all the specifics with it, but it is a very useful longitudinal type of design to use, especially when the values of our variables may change over time. And that's true for the vast majority of variables that we look at in program evaluation. So typically we're going to have to use a quasi as opposed to an experimental type of design. And in selecting between the two, ask yourself the question, how much control do I have as the evaluator? Do I control who participates? Do I control when the program is implemented? If you have that type of control, you can be more experimental in nature. If you don't have that type of control, then you're probably in a category of quasi-experimental types of evaluation designs. Next, we have to determine where our information will come from. And this is our process of sampling. Now, again, you probably remember this from the undergraduate level, but there are two primary categories of sampling designs. There are probability designs and non-probability designs. A probability type of sampling design is one in which we have the ability to randomly select who is participating in our evaluation. So it uses a random process to sample. So we have to put a sample together because we don't have the resources in order to collect information from every single person who participates in this program. So instead, we'll take a subset of that target population known as a sample, and we'll collect our information from that smaller sample. Statistically, we know that the larger the sample size becomes, the more representative that sample is of its target population. But we also know, as we said, we have limited resources to do our evaluation, so we may not have the resources to put together a gigantic sample, but hopefully we put together a sample that's large enough that will represent our population. So in probability sampling, we are randomly selecting cases to include in our evaluation. So the most random type of sample is a simple random sample. Simple random sample, we have a list of all the people who participate in this program. We will then number that list and assign every case a unique number. We'll then use a random number generator to determine which of those cases will then be selected for our sample. So random number generator tells us select case number 30. Case number 30 becomes part of our evaluation. It'll tell us select case number 147. Number 147 becomes part of our evaluation. It's a simple random sample. Obviously, the nice thing about simple random sample is it is about close to random as you can possibly get. So hopefully that sample will closely approximate the characteristics in the population. Now, we don't always have the luxury of doing simple random sampling. Think about a situation where you don't have a list of all the people who are participating in the program. A good example of that would be we want to evaluate the programs that are being offered by a local public health clinic. That local public health clinic is providing these programs on an anonymous basis. So, since it's done on an anonymous basis, we don't have a list of participants. So instead, what we can do as an evaluator is we can stand outside the local health clinic and we can interview every 10th person or every 15th person that walks out of that local health clinic. That would be an example of systematic sampling. That third sample design on the screen, that's systematic sampling. Systematic sampling, again, is good to use if you don't have a sampling frame, a list of all of your participants, but it is not purely random. Because if you're selecting every 10th person for inclusion in your evaluation, by definition, it means person number 9 and person number 11 who walks out that door will have a 0 chance of being selected. To be purely random, the definition of pure random is that everyone has an equal non-zero chance of being selected. You may get that with simple random sampling. You are not going to get that with systematic sampling. So the caveat we have to remember is that our sample may not be as representative of the population of people using this local health clinic as it may have been if we were able to do simple random sampling. But the decision really is guided by, do we have a list of those participants? Stratified random sampling is an approach if there is one characteristic that is so important to us that we want to separate or stratify our sample according to that one characteristic, then we can use something like stratified random sampling. So an example could be if you have a senior center. And in that senior center, they have recognized that the problem they want to address is that there have been a lot of falls among their residents. So they put a program in place to try and mitigate and reduce the number of falls. So they take all the people who are in that senior citizen center, they construct a sample, and they stratify the sample according to those residents who have fallen versus those who have not fallen. That's a stratified type of random sample. So you're randomly selecting those who have fallen, and then for your other sample, randomly selecting from those who have not fallen. The fourth type of probability design that is very useful for us in program evaluation is a multi-stage cluster sampling approach. This is something that the Census Bureau used to do back when they used to do research. Not to be too jaded, but back when the Census Bureau used to do research, with the exception of their every 10-year enumeration of the population, in those intervening years, they would do a lot of multi-stage cluster sampling. So say, for instance, we want to see the impact of a program on households in the state of California. We probably lack a list of all the households in the state of California. So what we'll do is we'll start with a list of all the counties in California. We'll then take a random sample of counties. From that random sample of counties, we'll select a random sample of cities. From that random sample of cities, we'll select a random sample of neighborhoods. From the random sample of neighborhoods, we'll select a random sample of streets. From that random sample of streets, we'll then select a random sample of neighborhoods. We now have kind of drilled down to the unit of analysis we're interested in for our evaluation, which is the household level, even though we don't have a list of all the households in the state of California. So multi-stage cluster sampling is a very common approach that we use when we lack a sampling frame, a list, at the unit of analysis that we are trying to measure. If we want to generalize our results, you probably remember from undergraduate that there's a very important a type of validity known as external validity. External validity is our ability to generalize from a sample to a population. If we are concerned about external validity and we want to take the results from the evaluation of this sample and generalize those results to our larger population of all program participants, then we're probably going to try and approximate a probability type of sample with random sampling. However, the second category of sampling designs are non-probability designs. This does not use random sampling. One example would be convenience. So I want to know what MPA students think about some aspect of the MPA program. So I ask you tonight, because you're in front of me here on a Tuesday evening, you're a convenience sample. It doesn't mean that you are necessarily representative of the rest of the MPA student population. So I could not generalize those results. Snowballing is another non-probability design. So if you are dealing with, for example, people who lack adequate housing, then you're not able to send anything to their address or to their email. So therefore, you're going to have to meet them in person. You find one person who fits that criteria, have that person refer you to someone else, and so on and so on. So it's a referral type of way of creating a sample, hence the reason why it's called snowballing. The more referrals you get, the larger and larger your sample becomes. Once we have our sampling, we know where our data are coming from. We then have to collect it. In program evaluation, one of the most common ways to collect data is through survey-based research. In your 696 course, you will talk about constructing surveys because we do this a lot in program evaluation. You'll talk about how to write questions that are unbiased. You'll talk about how to write response categories that match the nature of the question they're supposed to be responding to. You'll talk about how to sequence your questions on a survey. It's always good if you have a sensitive question to put that question later in the survey than at the beginning of the survey. So if you have an income type of question, income questions tend to be highly sensitive. If that's one of the first couple questions they're going to answer on the survey, there's a good chance that they'll stop at that point and your response rates will go down. If you can bury that question later in your survey, once people have already filled out 18 out of 20 questions, chances are they're going to go ahead and submit that survey because of sunk costs. They've already put the time in, so they're going to go ahead and submit the survey. We also oftentimes couple survey-based research with secondary data. We use archival data, especially if we have data that's already been collected by other governments or other organizations. If we have qualitative data, we are probably going to use interviews or focus groups, although those are less common oftentimes in program evaluation. But if you want to see the lived experience of a program participant, you're probably going to have to collect that information from an interview or from a focus group. One of the nice things about surveys in program evaluation is they are very flexible. So a survey can collect both qualitative as well as quantitative information. We can collect qualitative information from open-ended survey questions, quantitative information from closed-ended survey questions. So it's a really nice flexible combination of the two different approaches in surveys. Once we have our data, we then have to clean the data and then we have to analyze the data. After we clean our data, we analyze it using statistics. The type of statistical approach we use will depend upon the purpose of our evaluation, the types of variables that we are using. So if we just want to describe the profile of someone, the demographic profile of someone who's using a program, a descriptive type of analysis would certainly work. All your good old friends with mean and mode and median and standard deviation, those all describe the distribution of the characteristics of people who are using the program. If we want to try and draw associations between participation in the program and some other variables, obviously that's where we'll use our associational statistics. So we can use things such as gammas and Kendall tau B's and Kendall tau C and Somers DYX and all those fun associational types of measures of association. If we want to do causal research, we want to ask the question, how does participation in this program affect this dependent variable? And that's typically what we want to do in a program impact type of evaluation. That's where we're going to need to use causal types of statistics. So that's going to get us into the realm of multiple regression analysis, maybe for stochastic variables, maybe econometrics, logistic regression, probit, logit. That's where we'll get into some of those kind of more sophisticated types of statistical analysis. So we really can, with confidence, say, yes, participation in this program has made it more likely for this person to show up to their court date. So yes, participation in this intervention program has made it more likely that they'll appear in court, or has made it less likely that they will recidivate and reoffend. So the type of statistics we'll use will depend upon what we are trying to achieve with our program evaluation. And then obviously, based upon those statistical analyses, we will then arrive at our conclusions, and we will then derive conclusions about the effectiveness of the program based upon this entire process. So as you can see, program evaluation really does follow a lot of the same parameters that we follow in social science research, with a few changes here and there. When you get to 696, the whole purpose of the class will be application. You won't be calculating statistics, but instead what you'll be doing is how can I take these social science research methods and apply them for the purposes of the evaluation that I'm doing for this public program. So we as public administrators are not just involved in leading and managing our organizations. We're not just involved in formulating and implementing policies. We're not just involved in evaluating programs, but we're doing all of this for the purpose of trying to make things more effective, to make our organizations more effective, to make our policies more effective, and to make our programs more effective. Which begs the question, what is effectiveness? Now, very early on in this class, we talked about one of the main differences between public and private organizations is that in public organizations, we are highly concerned about multiple values. Yes, effectiveness, yes, efficiency, political responsiveness, social equity, protection of individual rights, representative bureaucracy. We have a multitude of different values. In the private sector, the two primary values are effectiveness and efficiency. But that's not to say that we're not also very interested in effectiveness here in the public sector. When we think about effectiveness, whether it be an organization or a policy or a program, we have so far defined effectiveness as the ability to achieve outcomes, the ability to achieve our goals. So if an organization is achieving its goals, we say that organization is effective. If a policy or program is achieving their goals, we say the policy or the program is effective. But that is only one way of measuring effectiveness in the public sector. So what I'd like to do here briefly now is to offer up to you 4 different models of effectiveness, 4 different ways in which we can define and measure effectiveness, whether it be an organization, a policy, or a program. And those 4 different models of effectiveness are the goal attainment approach, the systems resource approach, the participant satisfaction approach, and the internal process approach. 4 different ways in which we can measure effectiveness. So the goal attainment approach to measuring effectiveness in the public sector is by far the simplest approach, and is based upon this link between our stated goals and whether or not we see the organization as being effective. So how well are we achieving our goals? How well are we attaining our goals? That is the goal attainment approach. It is the simplest and by far the most common approach to measuring effectiveness. The problem with the goal attainment approach is that it is very simplistic and oftentimes doesn't consider a lot of complications. It doesn't consider things such as different types of goals. So when you think about an organization, organizations can have official goals and they can have what are called operative goals. An official goal is the long-term goal that that organization is trying to achieve. The operative goal is a shorter-term goal that you're trying to achieve on your way toward that official goal. So you may have multiple operative goals that hopefully, if things work right, will help you achieve your official long-term overall goal. The goal attainment approach doesn't really take in those different types of goals into account and doesn't take into account when those goals may actually conflict with each other. Even though the operative goal is supposed to help you meet your official goal, sometimes operative goal and achieving an operative goal will actually take you down the wrong path in terms of achieving your official goal. So it doesn't really distinguish between these different types of goals and the different subtypes of goals, official versus operative. It's not as nuanced as you would like it to be oftentimes. It also views the world as a very rational and orderly place. So we establish our goal, we then do these types of activities that will then help us establish that goal, help us achieve that goal. But as we all know, the public sector is oftentimes not that rational and not that orderly. So even though the goal attainment approach to measuring effectiveness is by far the most common, it is not the only approach that we can use for measuring effectiveness. The second model of measuring effectiveness is called the systems resource model. And the systems resource model is very similar to open systems theory that we talked about when we talked about the theoretical perspectives. Remember the open systems theory approach. We said we study organizations as part of a larger whole, and we look at how the organization interacts with its environment and how the environment then affects the organization. This kind of two-way street between the two. That is essentially how we can measure effectiveness. So, this approach to effectiveness concentrates on how well the organization or the policy or the program has extracted valuable resources from the environment. So, as we know from open systems discussion, there are a lot of different types of resources that organizations, for example, can extract from the environment. They can bring in new staff. They can bring in extra money in terms of their budget, appropriations or grant money. They can bring in political support from policymakers. They can bring in support from clients and the beneficiaries of their programs and their policies. So those are all resources that can be brought into the organization. So, what we do is we consider an organization effective if it has been successful at bringing in and exploiting all these different types of resources from its external environment. So, we have to, by definition, to use a systems resource approach, we have to take a longitudinal type of perspective where we'll look at the resources the organization has in the beginning and then look at the resources they have at a later point in time and look at how those resources have expanded and grown over that longitudinal time period. The nice thing about a systems resource approach is it gives us an empirical basis for measuring effectiveness when it's more difficult to use a goal attainment approach. So if it's more difficult for us to identify our goals and define our goals, it's going to be difficult for us to measure the effectiveness, say, for an organization. However, this is a pretty straightforward one in that we can look at the amount of resources we brought in and have we been able to bring in additional resources. The problem with this one is that obviously we need to quantify those resources and which resources are most important. Maybe you have increased your staffing level. Well, that's a good sign of effectiveness, but maybe you haven't increased your budgets. You haven't increased your resources beyond just those staffing levels. Maybe you have solicited and gained political support, but not political support from the policymakers who really can have a positive impact upon your organization. So there's even a little bit more subjectivity that's involved here than we would initially think. But systems resource is an open systems approach. How have we basically exploited the external environment to gain more resources for our organization? And that is then a central measure of our effectiveness. A third approach of effectiveness is participant satisfaction. Participant satisfaction is an ecological model that defines effectiveness according to your ability to satisfy key strategic constituencies in your environment. So if you are an organization, you want to know how satisfied those beneficiaries, those consumers of your goods and services are. How happy are they with what they are getting from this organization? If you're looking at a policy or a program, how satisfied are they with what they are getting from this policy and this program? So you look at your constituencies, you look at your stakeholders, called a participant satisfaction model. Cities do this all the time. And most cities now will use citizen satisfaction surveys. That is a participant satisfaction model of effectiveness. Now, when you're looking at the satisfaction of your stakeholders, of your participants, you can look external, you can also look internal. So if you're looking external, you are looking at, again, those beneficiaries outside of your organization that are benefiting from your products and your services and how satisfied they are. So it kind of bleeds over into an open systems type of approach. Or you can also look internal to your organization, and your internal stakeholders are obviously your employees. So when you're looking at your employees, it kind of becomes more of a human relations, human resource type of approach, looking internal to the organization at your internal stakeholders. But a participant satisfaction approach measures effectiveness by the satisfaction of your stakeholders. And then the fourth approach to measuring effectiveness is the internal process approach. The internal process approach, we look at the activities that are going on in a daily basis within the organization, and we're essentially here looking for indicators of organizational health, organizational efficiency. So you look internal to the organization, and you look at indicators such as the culture of the organization that we talked about last week and how strong that culture is. You look at the work climate and how positive is that work climate. You look at team spirit, the amount of teamwork that's going on, the group loyalty within the organization, the amount of confidence, trust, and communication between workers and managers, how decisions are being made within the organization. Are decisions being made where the information is? So are these decisions being made at the decision-making points? Are they being made by people who have access to that information? Clearly, if decisions are being made on high and then just being handed down, that's probably not going to be a good sign of effectiveness from an internal process model because people are making the decisions that don't have the information. They don't have proximity to that information. Sharing of relevant facts and feelings, kind of your horizontal, vertical communication system within the organization. Your reward system, are there adequate rewards that are being provided to managers for the performance, growth, and development of their subordinates? And the interaction between the organization and all of its component parts, when conflicts occur, those conflicts get resolved within the interests of the organization. Essentially, again, what you are looking for here is you're looking for measures of organizational harmony and organizational health. And that's how you then define the effectiveness of the organization. That's called an internal process approach. Now, here for this internal process model of effectiveness, it is applicable primarily to organizations, probably a little bit more so than maybe policies and programs. The participant satisfaction approach applies to organizations, policies, and programs. Systems resource applies to all three. The goal attainment approach applies to all three as well. This internal process approach looks more at organizations, obviously, than it does policies and programs. So, what are some discrete, specific dimensions and measures of effectiveness that we can look at? Well, if you're trying to measure overall effectiveness, we can look at discrete measures such as the productivity of employees, the efficiency in which resources are being used. If you are a government corporation, perhaps the amount of profit and changes in your profit. That's going to be for a government corporation or a GSE as opposed to being for a traditional public organization. The quality of the output that is being produced. Number of accidents, the amount of growth in terms of resources. That would be a systems resource type of approach. Absenteeism, employee turnover, job satisfaction, motivation levels, and so on and so on. I'm not going to read through all 30 of these dimensions, but just kind of gives you an idea of some of the specific things that we are looking at when we are trying to quantify effectiveness in the public sector. And then to compare these four different models of effectiveness to each other. Here is a matrix, and whenever I teach organization theory, I always use this matrix of effectiveness, where it's by Quinn and Rohrbach, and what it does is it compares basically these four different models of effectiveness based upon two different characteristics. So you'll see there is a y-axis and there is an x-axis. So the y-axis runs from flexibility down to control. So the models that are at the top of the chart are flexibility models that favor flexibility. The ones at the bottom favor more top-down control. On the left are those models that favor an internal approach, looking within the organization. On the right, those are an external approach, looking beyond the walls of the organization. So at your bottom right, where it says rational goal, this is essentially a goal attainment model of effectiveness. So the goal attainment model of effectiveness, We will engage in strategies such as planning and goal setting for the purpose of trying to be productive at achieving our goals. So our ultimate end is to try and achieve our goals, hence the goal attainment approach. It's at the bottom right because there's much more of an emphasis placed upon control, because oftentimes these goals are handed down through the organization chart. So it's a very top down control oriented type of approach. And it's also listed on the external side because as public organizations and policies and programs, we oftentimes do not have the ability to establish our own goals. Our goals are oftentimes dictated by legislative bodies. So the legislative body that created the organization or created the policy of the program, they're the ones who have created those goals, and then we try to achieve those goals. Hence the reason why it's on the right side, on the external side of the matrix. Top right, that open systems is essentially systems resource model. So in the systems resource model, our goal is growth and resource acquisition. So we measure our effectiveness by how well we have grown and how well we have acquired necessary resources. To acquire those necessary resources, we have to be very adaptable. We have to be very flexible to our environment so we can import those resources into our organization. Clearly, it's on the right-hand side because it really looks at external to the organization. It is also at the top because it really favors flexibility. In order to obtain those precious resources from the environment, we have to remain very flexible as an organization or as a program. Top left, what is listed there is a human relations model. I would put this more as what we talked about with the third model, participant satisfaction. And the thing about the participant satisfaction model is it kind of bleeds over. So if in the participant satisfaction model, we are looking at stakeholders outside our organization, then in that participant satisfaction model, we're kind of bleeding over into the open systems resource type of a model. If, however, we are looking inside our organization at the satisfaction of our employees, that's what then gives it more of this flavor of a human relations model. Looking at the cohesion and morale of our employees inside our organization, how satisfied they are, and then how that eventually will lead, hopefully, to human resource development on the part of those individual employees. Then on the bottom left, we have the internal process model. The internal process model is certainly much more oriented around control, but it's certainly internal to the organization. Here we look at developing information management and communication types of systems for the purpose of creating this organizational harmony, this purpose of achieving this stability, what we talked about last week as this point of homeostasis. So this matrix just kind of allows you to compare the different types of models to each other, where they sit in terms of external versus internal focus, where they sit in terms of favoring flexibility or emphasizing control. But those, even though the words are a little bit different here, the four different models are again the goal attainment model, that's bottom right, systems resource model, that is top right, the participant satisfaction model, if it looks at employees, is going to be that top left, looking at human relations type of an approach. If it is looking more externally, then that's going to bleed over into the systems resource. And then finally, the fourth model, the bottom left, the internal process model, looking inside the organization for those discrete indicators of organizational harmony and organizational health. I like to present these four different models of effectiveness because, again, the whole purpose of going through this program is to provide you with the competencies that you need to lead and manage public organizations. That's our number one competency of our 5 universal required competencies. Number 2 competency is to be able to participate in and contribute to the policy process. So when we are participating in that policy process and the process of implementing and evaluating programs, we are doing it for the purpose of making those programs better and making those policies better. So effectiveness is, again, a major aspect of the competencies that you'll get as you move through this program. So it's important for us to know how we measure effectiveness depending upon what we are doing in our organizations, in our policies, and in our programs. So it kind of ties all these different universal required competencies together and shows us that how we measure effectiveness in the public sector is a much more nuanced, multi-dimensional approach than maybe we would have thought of when we only think about in terms of how well we accomplish our goals. So this is basically giving you an introduction into PPA 670 policy analysis and the role of public administrators in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of policies, as well as PPA 696 and the role of public administrators in evaluating public programs from an empirical basis. So hopefully now when you go into 670 and 696, you'll kind of have that foundation to give you a leg up in being successful in both of those courses. It's almost 6:20, so clearly we don't have time to do breakout rooms, so we're not doing those tonight. Um, where we go from here, the remainder of the class, which is essentially 1 week, is to look at our next two functions of public administration, managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. Managing human resources will be insight into PPA 577. Managing fiscal resources will be insight into PPA 555. I'm kind of loath to start that now because it's kind of a completely different topic than we've been talking about for the majority of the evening. And I also believe that next week we will have ample time in our session to get through both managing human as well as managing fiscal resources. So I think we'll stop there for tonight. With the information that you have gotten tonight, you now have the information you need for scenarios 4 and 5, I believe it is, on the final assessment. The information you'll need for scenarios 1, 2, and 3 is what we will get to when we get together again next Tuesday. So at this point in time, do you have any questions about the material we've covered in terms of policy analysis and program evaluation? Okay. As you start working on that final assessment, again, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I think all the questions you have will probably be resolved after we talk about the material on managing human and fiscal resources in our final class session next Tuesday. If you haven't done so already, please make sure to get the midterm assessments submitted by midnight, as well as Canvas essay number 4. Then next week, Canvas essay number 5, and then by March the 10th will be the final assessment will be due. Okay? All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for your participation. Sorry to talk so much tonight, but I know we have a lot of information to cover to make sure that you are prepared, not only for the final assessment, but prepared when you leave this course to go into your future core courses as well. So apologize for a lot of the talking, but we'll be back at the next Tuesday, and hope you have a great remainder of your week, and I will talk to you again our final time next Tuesday. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.
Professor, have a good one.
You too. Take care.